Hello and welcome. I'm Neil Howard, your host. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment of Health Professional Radio. We'll be speaking with KimberLee Heidmann in this segment, Executive Vice President of Patient Experience and Customer Success at Scout Clinical. Scout Clinical is part of the Meeting Protocol Worldwide family. She's joining us to discuss Scout Clinical's mission to help patients stay enrolled in clinical trials. Welcome to Health Professional Radio. KimberLee Heidmann, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
As Executive Vice President of Patient Experience and Customer Success at Scout Clinical, give us a brief look into your professional background and talk about your position there, a little bit about what it is that you do.
Absolutely, happy to. So I started in the life sciences industry in the late 90s. I had a privilege and an opportunity to work with a couple of principal investigators who were with the World Health Organization Mental and Behavioral Disorders Unit. And one of the investigators was at Henry Ford, one was at UCLA. And my responsibility very early on in my young career was just to support writing grants for these investigators. And it's when I really became aware of the research industry and the good that it could do, specifically in the neuroscience field at the time. But as my career progressed and I joined the Meeting Protocol family of companies, I was responsible for overseeing the operations for the company for investigator education. So working specifically with the pharmaceutical and biotech companies to educate the investigators and the clinical research coordinators on the protocols, the conduction of the studies, and we really facilitated the coordination of that education and those trainings. In 2016, we started the company that is now Scout Clinical and shifted our focus from not only the education of the researchers, but to supporting the patients in clinical research. And my particular responsibility was to oversee the services side of the business and what we were going to do to actually position ourselves in the industry to support the patients and their families. And so over the last few years, I've had the opportunity to work directly with advocacy groups and patients and their families, clinical researchers, and the sponsors that drive the studies to learn more about the patient experience and trial design and how we can really add services that will enhance the patient experience, but not only enhance the patient experience, actually drive that experience forward so that they're able to overcome the barriers and the burdens that have been so difficult in clinical research in the past and shift the focus away from just looking at the participants as subjects that are moving through the trial and the assessments, but to participants who are partners in the success of the trial. So it's been a very exciting career for me, and I really enjoy what I do.
It's my understanding that clinical trial participants need to travel some long distances in some instances to visit some of these sites. What are some of the other challenges that researchers face in orchestrating these trials? Transportation obviously can't be, the biggest barrier.
Yeah, you're right. Now, there is a broadening of clinical research in terms of how we are finding patients and where we are including patients in research. So as you're well aware, even FDA now has some initiatives pushing forward to ensure that we're having the most diversity and inclusion that we can in clinical research so that the patient populations are representative of our global society. We need to be looking at research through the eyes of every person, right, and how the drug impacts each person's body differently, whether they are from different ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, gender. All of these things impact the outcomes of research. And so in order to have the most detailed and most accurate outcomes, we really need to have these patient populations and samples from all over the world. And so you're right, travel to the Centers for Excellence or the treatment centers for the clinical research can be a very significant barrier to reaching these more diverse patients. Let's say you have patients that are in underserved populations in indigenous communities or in rural areas where it's very difficult to get to those treatment centers. So those are some of the barriers that are presented with achieving reaching these populations. But you specifically said, difficulties for the researchers themselves. The investigators and the clinical research coordinators are in the business of conducting the trial. They are in the business of caring for the patient clinically. And so in order for them to do that, they need to be able to focus on their core skills and what they're supposed to do, which is carrying out the protocol, caring for the patient, administering the assessments. And so we don't want them to be burdened by overcoming these other barriers, which would be the financial barriers or reaching those patients, transporting them to the sites. So partners like Scout Clinical can stand in the gap for the researchers and do those activities for them so that they can focus on what they need to be doing, which is caring for the patient and executing the trial.
What about the nature of the trial itself, say rare diseases as opposed to clinical trials that have a larger potential patient population?
Right now, one of the topics that is being discussed very widely in our industry and is specifically in rare disease is cross-border enrollment. And how do we design the trials and how do we work with the clinical trial sites to identify patients in certain areas, but then treat them in another region or another country altogether? Because when you have a rare disease study, you have such a small population, rare and ultra rare, these patient populations are so small. And when you identify a patient and when a rare disease patient achieves an accurate diagnosis, they need to have that care very quickly. So in a lot of trials, it's not only identifying the patient and then determining what the barriers are going to be to, say, that cross-border enrollment. Where do we consent the patient? How do we take care of the regulatory activities that have to happen before we can actually collect and process that patient data and get them to the trial site? Those types of questions have to be addressed. And we also have to address the patient themselves. What are their needs? What are their particular needs? And what is the timing that has to occur for them to reach that screening visit or to enroll in the trial? So many times you not only have the impact of where they are located or what the requirements are, but you also have time impediments. So we may be operating under very short time windows for that patient to get on trial.
Could you tell us more about how Scout Clinical directly helps these trial organizers increase patient retention and then the progress that you anticipate Scout is going to experience in the coming years?
Yes. So Scout Clinical specifically provides patient services in the form of coordination of travel logistics and financial mitigation. So what we'll do is we keep the trial participation cost neutral for the patient by providing for their logistical coordination, whether that be travel or transportation, visa support, that cross-border enrollment that I spoke about, regulatory support for our sponsors, and then also through payments as well. So I think, one of the things that we're really trying to focus on is we're very good at certain things, and we want to keep those core competencies and then partner with other vendors in the space and really think about trial design and start speaking with the sponsors and be more involved at the outset in trial design and how can we look at what the patient participation is going to be and provide for that at the outset. So in the future, what we're hoping to do and what we're moving towards in our initiatives is to have more discussions with the patient advocacy groups, as well as coordinating that discussion with members from the pharma industry, those folks that are focused on diversity and inclusion in clinical research, and push the discussion forward so that we're not just advocating for our own services as partners in the life sciences space, but really creating a toolbox. We want to create a toolbox for sponsors where they can come to the subject matter experts and ask us, how should we build this design? How should we consider the mental health of the patient? What should we consider for cost neutrality? And then bring really excellent trial design to the space for the patients and their families.
Give us a website, if you would, where our listeners can learn more about Scout Clinical.
Yeah, you can go to scoutclinical.com. We also have our meetingprotocol.com. Meeting Protocol is the parent company for Scout Clinical and Atlas Clinical Academy. So if you'd like to learn more about us, please just go to meetingprotocol.com, click on Scout Clinical, and learn more about what we do.
KimberLee, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time with us this morning here on Health Professional Radio.
Absolutely, Neil. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with KimberLee Heidmann. Audio copies of this program are available at healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also reach us at Anchor, Spotify, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.